Imagine a world where the sun never sets, where the air is always warm, and the seas are as calm as glass. Now, imagine that in this perfect world, a storm suddenly brews, and everything you know and love is turned upside down. That's what the Reformation felt like for many people in the 16th century. And at the heart of this storm was a man named John Calvin. Calvin wasn't a king or a prince. He wasn't a soldier or a knight. He was a quiet, studious man who spent his days reading and writing. But his ideas were like a lightning bolt that split the sky, changing the way people thought about God, the Bible, and their own lives. Today, we're going to explore why John Calvin matters and why his story is still important to us. John Calvin was a complex figure. He was a theologian, a pastor, and a reformer. But more than that, he was a human being who lived in a time of great change and turmoil. Born in 1509 in a small town in France, Calvin grew up in a world where the Catholic Church held immense power. The church was like a giant tree, its roots deep and its branches sprawling. But as Calvin grew older, he began to see that the tree was rotten at its core. The church's teachings didn't align with what he believed the Bible said. This realization set Calvin on a path that would change his life and the lives of millions of others. Calvin's ideas didn't come out of nowhere. They were the result of deep study, reflection, and a burning desire to understand God better. He believed that the Bible, not the church, should be the ultimate authority in matters of faith. This was a radical idea at the time. The church had always been the final word on religious matters, but Calvin argued that the Bible inspired by God should guide people's beliefs and practices. One of Calvin's most significant contributions was his book, Institutes of the Christian Religion. This massive work, which he revised several times, is like a map for understanding the Christian faith. It covers everything from the nature of God to the role of the church. Calvin wrote it to help people navigate the stormy waters of religious change. He wanted to provide a clear, logical, and scripturally grounded guide for anyone seeking to understand and live out their faith. Calvin's ideas weren't always popular. He faced opposition from those who disagreed with him, and his methods sometimes drew criticism. For example, his views on predestination, the idea that God has already chosen who will be saved, were and still are hotly debated. But despite the controversy, Calvin's influence continued to grow. His ideas spread across Europe and eventually around the world, shaping the beliefs of countless Christians. For many people, including myself, Calvin is more than just a historical figure. He is a friend, a guide, and a source of inspiration. His writings have helped me understand the Bible, think about my faith, and live a more purposeful life. Even though he lived over 5 centuries ago, his voice still resonates today. As you read this book, I invite you to step into Calvin's world. Imagine yourself in 16th century Geneva, where Calvin lived and worked. Picture the streets, the people, and the debates that shaped his life. As we explore his ideas, his challenges, and his legacy, I hope you will find that John Calvin is not just a figure from the past, but a living, breathing guide who can help you navigate your own journey of faith. So, let's begin. The story of John Calvin is a story of change, of faith, and of a man who dared to challenge the world. Are you ready to meet him? When students first read Calvin's Institutes, they often find it surprisingly biblical. Many think it's just a dense theological book, but it's actually deeply rooted in the Bible. Calvin doesn't stray from the Bible when he makes doctrinal statements. Instead, he carefully explains what the Bible teaches based on his interpretation. Calvin's interpretation is consistent and grounded in his firm belief that he is explaining God's Word. His entire theological system is a systematic development of biblical teaching. He breaks down topics into detailed explanations, forming a strong foundation for what the church should believe. This method is still important today. When we try to understand a theological belief, we should start by reading the Bible carefully, then analyze and evaluate what theologians or scholars say about it. This helps us form our own beliefs. Calvin wasn't the only reformer to write such a book. Other reformers, like Philip Melanchthon and Ulrich Zwingli, also published theological works. Melanchthon's Los Communes, Commonplaces, explain Christian doctrines in a structured way, while Zwingli's Commentary on True and False Religion compared and contrasted the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church and the Protestants, often in a critical manner. Calvin wrote the Institutes for pastors, theologians, and those preparing for church leadership. He mostly wrote in Latin, the language of the educated, to ensure his readers were well versed in church doctrines. Since the Institutes are grounded in the Bible, Calvin encouraged readers to consult his Bible commentaries for deeper understanding. In the Institutes, Calvin integrates his knowledge of classical philosophers like Plato and Cicero, and early Christian authors like Athanasius, Chrysostom, and Augustine. He also interacts with medieval theologians like Anselm and Aquinas, often referencing or disagreeing with Peter Lombard's 4 books of sentences. Calvin frequently criticizes the Roman Catholic Church, arguing that it has strayed from the true teaching of the Bible, especially regarding doctrines like transubstantiation, the power of the papacy, and the selling of indulgences. The Institutes was Calvin's way of presenting a comprehensive theological teaching grounded in the Bible. He aimed to educate church leaders who would in turn educate the entire church. His education, influenced by the humanist spirit of his time, emphasized going back to the original sources, including the Bible's original languages, Greek and Hebrew. This approach allowed him to engage with the long history of Christian thought from the earliest times to his own era. Calvin's impact on the global church has been significant. His reforms in Geneva went beyond theological teaching and worship. He also focused on reforming people's lives through church discipline, which was upheld by the consistory, a body consisting of ministers and city councilors. The consistory ensured that people lived according to their faith, a practice that has influenced Christians worldwide by showing how faith should be reflected in daily life. Calvin also reformed marriage and the role of children in the church. Before the Reformation, marriages were often informal and could lead to problems like polygamy. Calvin introduced the practice of church weddings, where couples announced their intention to marry before the community, a practice still common today. He believed that children should receive early instruction in the faith, especially through singing. The church taught children to sing the Psalms, which they then sang at home, helping their parents learn too. Calvin also wrote catechisms to further instruct children, linking baptism and the Lord's Supper. Children were not allowed to partake in the Lord's Supper until they had completed catechism classes and made a profession of faith. Calvin's insistence on teaching and disciplining both adults and children has had a lasting impact on the church. His methods, grounded in the Bible and the broader Christian tradition, have shaped how the church operates and teaches, even today. Jean Calvin was born in Noyon, France, on July 10, 1509. When Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517, Calvin was only 8 years old. His father, Gerard Calvin, worked for the local bishop, and his mother, John Lafranc, died when Calvin was young. His father had big plans for him, hoping he would become a priest. To help with this, Calvin was sent to live and study with the children of the Montmorts, a noble family, where he learned Latin and other subjects. In 1523, Calvin moved to Paris to study at the Collège de la Marche. He changed his name to its Latin form, Ianus Calvinus, which became John Calvin in English. His teacher, Mathurin Cordier, had a lasting influence on him. Later, Calvin invited Cordier to teach at the Geneva Academy, which he helped found. Calvin's education continued at the Collège de Montaigu, where he studied philosophy and the works of Aristotle and Plato. The school was known for its strict discipline and piety, which may have influenced Calvin's own spiritual development. In 1527, his father changed his mind about Calvin's future, deciding he should become a lawyer instead of a priest. Calvin moved to Orleans to study law, where he excelled under the guidance of Pierre de l'Estoile and Melchior Wolmar, a Greek teacher who introduced him to the ideas of the Reformation. In 1529, Calvin went to the University of Bourges, where he studied under Andrea Alciati, a famous legal scholar. This move was influenced by Marguerite of Angoulême, the sister of King Francis I, who supported the humanist movement. Calvin's cousin, Pierre Robert Olivetan, also encouraged him to study the Bible deeply and to question the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. After his father's death in 1531, Calvin returned to Paris and abandoned his law studies. He became deeply involved in the humanist circles and published his first book, a commentary on Seneca's De Clementia, in 1532. Around this time, Calvin likely converted to Protestantism, though the exact details of his conversion are not known. He described it as a sudden conversion that brought him to a teachable mind in true godliness. In 1533, Calvin became friends with Nicolas Cop, the rector of the University of Paris. Cop's speech at the university's opening ceremony that year, which aligned with Protestant views, caused controversy. Calvin is believed to have helped write the speech, and both he and Cop had to flee Paris to avoid arrest. Calvin moved to the southern region of France, where he lived under the pseudonym Charles d'Espéfil. He began writing the first edition of his famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. He visited his old teacher, Jacques Lefebvre de Toples, who was also facing persecution. The situation in France became too dangerous, and Calvin and his friend Louis Duthier left for Basel, a city known for its humanist scholarship and publishing. In Basel, Calvin continued his studies of biblical languages, taking Hebrew classes from Sebastian Munster and Greek classes from Simon Grynaeus. He also wrote the foreword to his cousin Olivetan's French translation of the Bible, which was published in 1535. Calvin completed the first edition of the Institutes, which he dedicated to King Francis I, and it was published in 1536. Calvin traveled to Italy and met several supporters of the Protestant movement, including Renée of France, the Duchess of Ferrara, and the poet Clement Marot. When they learned that the Duke of Ferrara was under pressure to expel Protestants, Calvin and Duthier returned to Basel. Calvin then went back to Paris to settle some matters, knowing that he would not be able to stay in France for long. He planned to move to Strasbourg for a quiet life of writing, but the ongoing war between Charles V and Francis I forced him to take a detour through Geneva. Calvin intended to stay in Geneva just for the night, but his plans were about to change dramatically. The city of Geneva in the 16th century was a place of great change and excitement. A few years earlier, in 1526, Geneva had broken free from the control of the Duchy of Savoy and formed an alliance with the Swiss cantons of Bern and Fribourg. This alliance meant that if any of these cities were in trouble, the others would come to their aid. However, The Bishop of Geneva was still friendly with the Duke of Savoy and wanted Geneva to return to Savoy's control. In 1528, Bern, one of Geneva's allies, had embraced the Protestant Reformation. Bern sent Guillaume Farel, a passionate reformer, to Geneva to help spread the new ideas. With Bern's support, Farel and his team managed to convince the people of Geneva to adopt the Reformation. On May 21, 1536, the citizens of Geneva took an oath to follow the new Protestant teachings even before John Calvin, the famous reformer, arrived in the city. One night, as Calvin was passing through Geneva, he met a man named Dutillé who informed Farel about Calvin's presence. Farel, recognizing Calvin's potential, immediately sought him out. Farel was so passionate about Calvin staying in Geneva that he threatened to curse Calvin's peaceful studies if he left. Calvin, feeling the weight of Farel's words, decided to stay and help with the Reformation in Geneva. Calvin began his work by teaching at the church, focusing on Paul's letter to the Romans. Soon after, he was appointed as a professor of sacred literature. As the Reformation gained strength in Geneva, Calvin and Farel drafted a church order and a confession of faith to guide the young Protestant community. They presented these documents to the city council, but not everyone was on board. The council decided to hold the Lord's Supper quarterly instead of weekly, as Calvin had proposed. This disagreement, along with other tensions, led to a rocky relationship between the reformers and the city leaders. One of the main groups challenging Calvin and Farel was the Anabaptists. The Anabaptists believed in a strict separation from society and rejected practices like infant baptism. They faced persecution from both Catholics and other Protestants. Calvin often had to address the Anabaptist movement in his writings to distinguish his views from theirs. In 1538, the city council elected 4 new leaders, or syndics, who were more aligned with Bern. These leaders disagreed with Calvin and Farel on several issues, including the way worship services should be conducted. The disagreements escalated, and on April 23, 1538, Calvin and Farel were expelled from Geneva. They traveled to Basel, where Calvin stayed with his friend Simon Grenadius, unsure of his future in ministry. However, Calvin's time in Strasbourg, a city with a large community of French Protestant refugees, proved to be a turning point. Martin Bucer, a respected minister, invited Calvin to serve the church there. Calvin accepted and found Strasbourg to be an ideal place for his ministry. He learned a lot from Bucer about church discipline, preaching, and pastoral care. He also developed the idea of singing metrical psalms in French, which would become a significant part of his legacy. During his time in Strasbourg, Calvin revised and expanded his famous work, The Institutes of the Christian Religion. He also wrote a commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans and a treatise on the Lord's Supper. The latter was an attempt to bridge the gap between different Protestant groups, particularly the Lutherans. Calvin met with Philip Melanchthon, a leading Lutheran, to discuss the doctrine of the Lord's Supper. Despite their differences, Melanchthon was open to Calvin's ideas, and, for a moment, unity between the German and Swiss churches seemed possible. Calvin also faced theological challenges, such as those from Pierre Caroli, who accused him of heresy. Calvin defended his views on the Trinity, emphasizing that he and Farel did not reject the traditional teachings. He also tried to reach out to Martin Luther for support on issues affecting French evangelicals, but Luther's stance remained firm, and the efforts did not succeed. In 1540, Calvin married Idelette de Bure, a widow with 2 children. This marriage brought stability to his personal life, and he adopted Idelette's children as his own. Even while in Strasbourg, Calvin kept a close eye on Geneva. The church in Geneva continued to face internal conflicts, particularly between the Guillermins, who supported Farel and Calvin, and the Articulants, who opposed them. Calvin urged his followers in Geneva to avoid creating a schism and to work towards unity. However, the tensions led to the banishment of the Guillermins from the city. In 1539, Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto, a prominent figure in the Catholic Church, wrote a letter to Geneva, urging the city to return to the Catholic fold. The Genevan Church, recognizing the need for a strong response, turned to Calvin. Calvin wrote a detailed reply, explaining that the Reformation was not about destroying the Church, but about renewing it according to God's Word. The exchange between Sadoleto and Calvin was published and widely read, further solidifying Calvin's role as a leading figure in the Reformation. Despite the challenges, Calvin's time in Strasbourg was a period of growth and development, both personally and in his ministry. His work in Strasbourg laid the foundation for his eventual return to Geneva, where he would continue to shape the course of the Reformation. The Genevans had not forgotten about John Calvin. They had come to realize how much they needed him. Calvin's friends, like Cordier and Viret, also urged him to return to Geneva. Calvin, however, was hesitant. He still remembered the bad treatment he had received when he was there before. Plus, he was happy in Strasbourg, where he was leading a flourishing ministry among French refugees. In a letter to his friend Farel, Calvin wrote that even though he loved the people of Geneva, he was torn. He felt he should stay where God had placed him, but he also wanted to listen to the needs of the church in Geneva. The Geneva City Council sent a formal invitation on October 13, 1540, but Calvin didn't respond right away. He told the Genevans about his dilemma. He believed a minister should stay where God has called him, but he also wanted to help Geneva. On October 27th, Calvin wrote to Farel again. He said that if it were up to him, he wouldn't return to Geneva. But he saw himself as a servant of God, not his own master. He offered his heart to God, saying, "My heart I offer to you, Lord, promptly and sincerely." This statement, and the image of a heart on an open hand, became a symbol of Calvin's life and ministry. The official seals of Calvin Theological Seminary and Calvin University still bear this image with the Latin phrase, Cor meum tibi offero Domine, prompt et sincere. Calvin talked with the ministers in Strasbourg about the invitation from Geneva. Bucer, one of the leaders there, finally agreed that Calvin should return. The church in Geneva sent Viry from Lausanne to lead the church temporarily. On May 1, 1541, the City Council of Geneva officially lifted the ban on Calvin and invited him back. Calvin returned to Geneva on September 13, 1541. Once back in Geneva, Calvin got to work. He wrote a draft of a church order to regulate worship, church ministry, and Christian conduct in the city. A committee of Calvin, 6 city council members, and 4 other ministers worked on the draft. They presented it to the full city council on September 26, 1541, and it was approved in November. This document, called the Ecclesiastical Ordinances, was a city council document, not just a church document. By not putting his name on it, Calvin showed that the rules were for the good of the city, not just his own ideas. Calvin also faced challenges in his personal life. His wife, Idelette, was often sick, but gave birth to a son, Jacques, in 1542. Sadly, the baby died after less than a month. Idelette passed away in 1549, and Calvin was heartbroken. He wrote to Viret about his loss and promised to take care of Idelette's children from her previous marriage. The ecclesiastical ordinances included rules for church discipline and excommunication. At first, the city council decided that the church leaders could declare someone to be disciplined, but the actual excommunication had to be done by the city council. Calvin disagreed and argued that excommunication should be a church matter. The council eventually agreed with Calvin. Calvin's days in Geneva were busy. He preached twice on Sundays and 3 times during the week. On Thursdays, he met with the consistory, and on Fridays, he led Bible studies for the company of pastors. He also wrote biblical commentaries and expanded his famous book, The Institutes. Calvin cared deeply about the Huguenots in France, encouraging them to worship openly, or if they couldn't, to consider emigrating. If that wasn't possible, they should confess their guilt and pray for deliverance. Geneva became a refuge for many people facing religious persecution. People from Italy, England, Spain, and other regions came to Geneva for safety and to join the Reformed Church. Despite the challenges, Calvin's ministry grew. However, Calvin faced several controversies during his time in Geneva. The Anabaptists refused to follow the church order, and the libertines had strange ideas about the Spirit and rejected the idea of Jesus as the only Savior. Calvin wrote a tract against the libertines, explaining why he disagreed with them. Another controversy involved Sebastian Castellio, a Latin teacher who wanted to become a pastor. He disagreed with Calvin on some points, like the interpretation of the Song of Songs and the creed about Christ's descent into hell. The ministers agreed to let him have some differences, but Castellio refused to agree with the catechism. He left Geneva but later returned and caused a scene during a Bible study. Calvin asked the city council to ban him, and Castellio eventually moved to Basel. The most controversial event was the execution of Michael Servetus. Servetus had written a book rejecting the doctrine of the Trinity and other Orthodox beliefs. He was arrested in Geneva and put on trial. The city council sought advice from other cities, and they all agreed Servetus's teachings were heretical. Despite Calvin's request for a less severe punishment, the council decided to burn Servetus at the stake. Calvin and Farel visited Servetus in prison, asking him to change his views, but he refused. Servetus was executed on October 27, 1553. Critics often blame Calvin for Servetus's death, but it's important to understand the historical context. Servetus was a heretic and would have been condemned in any city at that time. The decision to execute him was made by the city council, not Calvin. Calvin's role was more about trying to find a less harsh punishment. John Calvin faced many challenges and controversies during his time in Geneva, but one of the most significant was the debate over the doctrine of predestination. This controversy involved a man named Jerome Bolsec, who was a former monk from Paris. Bolsec had converted to Protestantism and moved to Geneva, where he began attending the congregation, a regular Bible study meeting for pastors. On May 15, 1551, Bolsec challenged Calvin's view of free will during one of these meetings. According to Theodore Beza, Calvin's close friend and biographer, Bolsec's comments caused a stir. And when Calvin arrived, the debate heated up. Bolsec argued that God's predestination was not a fair doctrine because it meant that God had already decided who would be saved and who would not, which seemed to take away people's free will. Calvin, on the other hand, believed that God's election of individuals for salvation was a fundamental truth of the Bible. The debate became so contentious that Bolsec was arrested. The ministers of Geneva, along with their counterparts in Bern, Basel, and Zurich, were consulted for their opinions. All of them rejected Bolsec's teachings, and on December 18, 1551, Calvin made a long presentation on the doctrine of election. He explained that God chooses individuals for salvation, and this choice is not based on any merit or action of the person, but on God's sovereign will. The city council agreed with Calvin, and on December 21, 1551, Bolsec was permanently banned from Geneva. This controversy highlighted the complex relationship between civil and church authorities in Geneva. Although Calvin is sometimes mistakenly portrayed as having established a theocracy, where the church ruled over the city, the civil leaders maintained their own authority. However, in this case, they sided with Calvin and the church. Another example of the tension between civil and ecclesiastical authority in Geneva involved a man named Philibert Berthelier. Berthelier had been excommunicated from the church for drunkenness. In September 1553, he asked to be allowed to take part in the Lord's Supper again. The consistory, the church's governing body, had the authority to excommunicate and reinstate members, but the city council overruled them and allowed Berthelier to participate in the sacrament. Calvin was furious and protested to the city council, but they ignored his objections. During a service on September 3rd, Calvin preached a sermon expressing his dissatisfaction with the council's decision. Despite the council's ruling, Berthelier did not partake in the Lord's Supper that day. However, Calvin felt betrayed by the council's actions, and his evening sermon sounded like a farewell. The ministers of Geneva protested to the city council, and on September 7th, the council asked for a clear explanation of the 1541 church ordinances. Calvin explained that the consistory, not the city council, should have the final say in matters of excommunication and reinstatement. The council initially agreed with Calvin, but the issue flared up again in November when Berthelier requested to take the Lord's Supper once more. The consistory rejected his request, but the city council overruled them and allowed Berthelier to participate. The council asked for opinions from the churches in Bern, Zurich, Basel, and Schaffhausen, but the responses were mixed and did not resolve the issue. Finally, on October 24, 1554, a committee was appointed to look into the matter. On January 24, 1555, the committee decided that the consistory should have the authority to excommunicate and reinstate members, bringing the matter to a close. These controversies illustrate the challenges Calvin faced in trying to reform the church and establish a community where people could live according to their faith. Despite the conflicts, Calvin's vision for Geneva was to create a place where people could truly worship God and live as faithful Christians. His efforts, though not always smooth, left a lasting impact on the Reformed tradition and the way churches are governed today. More than a few people think that John Calvin came up with the idea of predestination, but that's not entirely true. The idea of predestination, which means that God has already decided who will be saved and who will not, was actually around long before Calvin. One of the earliest and most famous teachers of this idea was St. Augustine, who lived from 354 to 430. Augustine believed that God chose certain people for salvation before the world even began, and this choice was based entirely on God's grace, not on anything the person did. Calvin didn't invent this idea. He just built on what Augustine and others had already taught. Calvin thought that the Bible, especially passages like Romans 8 and Ephesians 1, clearly showed that God had chosen some people for salvation and others for eternal punishment. This idea is sometimes called double predestination. According to Calvin, people can't do anything to earn their salvation. It's a free gift from God. On the other hand, there was a man named Jacob Arminius who lived from 1560 to 1609. Arminius studied under Calvin's student Theodore Beza, but he didn't agree with everything Calvin taught. Arminius believed that God predestined people based on his foreknowledge of whether they would accept the gospel. In other words, God saw in advance who would believe in Jesus and chose those people for salvation. This view is different from Calvin's because it gives people a role in their own salvation. The big debate between Calvinists and Arminians came to a head in 1618 during a meeting called the Synod of Dort. The synod was called to settle the disagreements, especially over predestination. The synod decided against the Arminian view and affirmed what is now known as the 5 points of Calvinism. These points are often remembered using the acronym TULIP, total depravity. All people are born sinful and cannot save themselves. Unconditional election. God chooses people for salvation based on His own decision, not on anything they do. Limited atonement. Jesus died for the specific purpose of saving the people God chose. Irresistible grace. When God offers salvation, people cannot refuse it. Perseverance of the saints. Those God has saved will continue to believe and will not lose their salvation. However, Calvin himself never used the acronym TULIP. It was created much later, in the early 1900s, by a minister named Cleland Boyd McAfee. He used it as a way to help people remember the 5 points of Calvinism. The order of the points in the acronym doesn't match the order of the original articles from the Synod of Dort, but it's a helpful way to remember the main ideas. It's also important to understand that the term Calvinism refers to a broader set of beliefs that developed from Calvin's teachings. Calvinists are people who follow these beliefs. The term Reformed is often used interchangeably with Calvinism, but it can also refer to a wider range of beliefs that came from the Reformation, including those of other reformers like Martin Luther. Many people think of Calvin as a stern, angry, and humorless person, but that's not the whole story. Calvin was passionate about defending what he believed was the true teaching of the Bible. He faced a lot of opposition and criticism, and he didn't hesitate to speak strongly against those who disagreed with him. For example, he called some of his opponents dogs or swine, which were considered very strong words at the time. This was a common way of writing in the 16th century, but it's easy to see why it might make Calvin seem harsh. Calvin also believed that Christians should live their lives in a way that reflected their faith. He set up a group called the Consistory to help ensure that people in Geneva were living according to Christian standards. The Consistory would call people to answer for their sins, and this could be a scary experience. Calvin's intention was to help people grow in their faith, but it sometimes made him seem strict and unforgiving. Despite this, Calvin had a softer side that is often overlooked. He genuinely cared for people and wanted to see them grow in their relationship with God. He was a deep thinker and a careful writer, and his work has had a lasting impact on Christian theology. Calvin's life and teachings show that there was more to him than just the strict, stern image that some people have of him. Calvin's life and teachings have left a lasting mark on the world, but his image has often been clouded by the negative portrayals of his opponents. One of the most prominent critics was Jerome Bosek, who had a deep grudge against Calvin, especially over their disagreement on the doctrine of predestination. Bosek was exiled from Geneva, and in his bitterness wrote tracts and a biography that painted Calvin as a tyrant and a heretic. He even made false accusations about Calvin's past, such as claiming he was branded for sodomy, which historians have debunked. Despite these attacks, Calvin's true character shines through in his work and his relationships. Calvin was not the stern, unfeeling person many believed him to be. He was a caring and loving pastor who wanted to see people live out their faith in their daily lives. He believed that true Christian living meant being kind and helpful to others, especially the poor and those facing persecution. During his time in Geneva, the city became a haven for refugees, and the hospital cared for anyone in need, regardless of their background. Calvin's views on human nature might seem bleak at first. He believed that because of sin, humans are naturally inclined to be selfish and proud. However, he also taught that God's grace can transform people. Through Jesus, God restores the image of God in humans, allowing them to live as they were meant to, enjoying creation and showing love to others. This means that while Calvin saw the dark side of human nature, he also had a deep hope in the power of God's redemption. When it came to economic matters, Calvin was practical and cautious. He understood that money can be a tool for good, but it can also lead to greed and exploitation. He encouraged fair wages, controlled prices, and the establishment of a public bank to help the poor. Calvin believed that those who could help others should do so not just by giving money, but by actively seeking to alleviate suffering. He worked hard to ensure that the Geneva Hospital had the funds it needed to care for the sick and the needy. Calvin's legal training played a significant role in his theology. He used legal concepts to explain salvation, where God acts as a judge who declares us free from sin through the righteousness of Christ. This legal framework helped him clarify the relationship between the church and the state. In Geneva, he sought to balance the roles of the church and the city council, ensuring that both worked together to promote justice and righteousness. Calvin's approach to church and state differed from other Christian traditions of his time. Unlike Martin Luther, who saw the world divided into two kingdoms, the spiritual and the secular, Calvin believed that the church and the state should work together to uphold God's law. He was also different from the Anabaptists, who wanted the church to be completely separate from the state. Calvin's vision was that the church and the state should support each other in creating a society that reflects God's justice and mercy. In the end, Calvin's legacy is not just in the theological ideas he taught, but in the way he lived them out. He was a man who, despite his flaws, sought to bring the love and truth of God to his community. His influence continues to shape the way people think about God, the church, and society. Calvin's life shows that even in the face of opposition, it is possible to stand firm in one's beliefs, while also being compassionate and caring.